see with Prop 22, which is frankly the most dangerous labor law that I've seen in my lifetime. And in 2012 was that Uber, Lyft, and Sidecar, which has now gone under, started operating as Cisco. They became very popular services. Regulators created laws to accommodate their business model and allowed them to operate illegally for many months. And for a few years, although taxi workers saw their competition go up and go through the roof, workers were able to rely on it for some source of income, as I'm sure many of you have, because wages stayed high. They stayed high because they were subsidized by venture capitalists, so they were artificially high wages. The companies were losing money just left and right and continue to lose money in providing those wages. And since 2012, wages have just dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. So drivers tell me that they make now something like 60% of what they had made in 2012, and this was pre-pandemic estimates. So what happened? So for many years, we saw very little regulation, wide-scale regulation of labor on these platforms, primarily because the companies have so much power. They prevented, through their relationships, through their lobbying, state officials from enforcing any kind of employment laws against them and from creating any kinds of regulations that would protect workers. So in 2018, the Supreme Court decided a case called Dynamics v. Superior Court of LA that changed the test for who is an employee for purposes of wage orders in California. The result is that it became very clear that it would be difficult for Uber to argue that it was not an employer, because the test said, A, that there is a presumption of employment, and critically, B, if the worker is doing the same thing as the employer, as the hiring entity, if they're in the same business, then that person is a worker and not an independent contractor. And so the companies, again, using their significant structural and instrumental and discursive powers, tried to create a carve-out for themselves from this law. But instead, in 2019, the California legislature signed or passed AB 5, which put the decision that the California Supreme Court made in Dynamics, put it into the laws of California. Now, you all are probably familiar with this law because it ended up impacting many freelancers inadvertently in the journalism world in an attempt to sort of help them. But there has now been an amendment that is set to alleviate the stressors that it's put on freelance journalists, and to really, specifically stay targeted at large corporations that are misclassifying their workers. And so in August, so just last month, a California judge said that Uber and Lyft have been violating employment and labor laws, that their workers are employees, and that they should be at least provided with a wage floor and overtime compensation. And that, in fact, if you extend what the judge decided, that drivers in California are owed billions of dollars in back wages, because many people in this economy are making less than the minimum wage, are actually sometimes losing money, especially in the pandemic context where demand is so low. Proposition 22 is the most expensive proposition that has ever existed in the history of the United States. It's $188 million. And what the companies have done is flood the airwaves, flood drivers' apps, flood consumers' email boxes to convince California voters that this is good for workers. Let me explain to you what it does. So on the left is what drivers, all workers in California get, and on the right is what Prop 22 gives them. So the most critical thing that Prop 22 does is it removes time-based wage protections. So workers will only get paid for time when they have a rider assigned to them, which puts them at pre-pandemic time period when demand was high, puts them at earning roughly $5 an hour. So it is a roughly $5 an hour hourly guarantee. There is no sick leave, there is no workers' compensation in an industry that OSHA says is one of the most dangerous in America. There is no unemployment insurance. You have to work roughly 60 to 70 hours a week to get any healthcare subsidies, but there is no health insurance. There is no paid family leave and no protections for health and safety, again, in what is one of the most dangerous occupations in America. What I think is really not well understood by the voting public is that although it seems like this would only apply to Uber and Lyft drivers, Instacart, DoorDash, Uber Eats, Postmates, it actually has the potential to extend well beyond this industry to across the delivery economy. So anyone who is doing delivery work, if the company decides to go to create an app essentially, then and deploy the workers through an app, then they can use this highly exploitative model that really lowers labor costs um, from the company and cuts the ability of workers to make a um, a living. And I have a question here about, are we only talking Uber and Lyft here, or is this going to impact all contract workers? So it only, the way that it's written for transportation network companies. So that's like Uber and Lyft and other companies that try and compete, and delivery network companies. And so that's basically any delivery company that uses an app to deploy work. So that includes Postmates, DoorDash, Instacart, et cetera, but it also could grow to include many, many other companies. So you can imagine that because this lowers labor overhead so dramatically that other companies will reorganize their operations to fit into this model of delivery network companies. So in that sense, it's really, really dangerous. So I want to focus a little bit on its impact on consumers. So the way California and state law works is that you have to be an employee or an agent of a company in order to be held, in order for that company to be held liable for your actions. So if I get into a car, if I get into an Uber, and the Uber driver is drunk or high, and he gets into an accident, and in order, if I lost a limb, say as a result of the negligence of the driver, that driver could not, because they were a low income worker, I could try and sue the driver, but probably not going to get anything out of it. And really, would be Uber's responsibility to ensure that drivers are not driving drunk or not driving high. And if Prop 22 passes and I try and sue Uber, they will likely not be liable for the negligence of the driver. This also disincentivizes the companies from taking precautionary and preventative measures to ensure that their services are safe, because anything they do to control the drivers, like make them take periodic drug tests or ask them to attest to the fact that they are not drunk every time they log onto the app, anything that they do to try and make riders safe would make them would raise their liability. So it disincentivizes the companies from actually making these services safe, and really creates undesirable and unsafe environments for the consumers themselves. Prop 22 gives workers 120% of the minimum wage only for engaged time. So only for time that people have someone assigned to them. During the pandemic, that time was about 20% of the time that people were spending on the app. So people who were driving, spending their gas, paying for hybrid insurance, wearing and tearing on their car, they were actually losing money when they were driving, all said and done work. So this is a real attempt to permanently lower labor costs. This would be permanent, and I'll tell you why it would be permanent, because it has this unheard of measure which says that it would take 7/8 of the California legislature to amend any portion of the proposition. So it would be effectively impossible for Californians, consumers, workers, the legislature, if they decide something is not working, it would be virtually impossible to amend it. And so future generations, or in few years, if things change and we want to provide paid sick leave to workers in this economy, or we want to provide health insurance to workers in this economy, that would be impossible. It also prevents local regulators from regulating for these companies. I just want to end by telling you two things that you should take away from this that are most important. One is that this ensures that drivers will only get paid for engaged time, which is sometimes only 40 to 30% of the time they're driving. And it ensures that consumers will face a huge uphill battle, if not be completely prevented from holding these companies liable if they're injured, raped, or otherwise abused while using the service.
Right now, quite frankly, is not a good time to be a gig worker. Many gig workers are very vulnerable. They're in jobs that carry a high risk of exposure to COVID because they are often working in close proximity with strangers, whether they are driving strangers in their personal cars or being asked to go into a stranger's private home to do, for instance, TaskRabbit organizing or cleaning work. We've also seen that gig workers are in jobs that have been especially vulnerable to a massive decrease in demand. So we saw this, of course, with Uber and Lyft drivers, but also other gig workers. So dog walkers saw most of their business dry up. TaskRabbit workers who were doing cleaning, who were doing personal errand running or personal assistant work, their work dried up. Airbnb hosts, their work dried up. In fact, I've spoken to a number of Airbnb hosts who have actually started closing down their listings because they cannot afford to keep them open anymore. So this has very much been a lose-lose situation for the workers. The work is dangerous and there's little demand. But there has been increased demand in some areas, specifically in terms of demand for workers on food delivery apps such as DoorDash and Uber Eats and Grubhub, and in grocery shopping apps like Shipt and Instacart. But with that increased demand is also coming an increased supply. So workers who were using these apps previously are now seeing increased competition. And what they thought of as a fairly dependable source of income, now they might be on these apps for hours, hitting refresh and never getting anything because it's the newest round of people that are able to grab those requests. Workers have turned to what we call the side hustle safety net because they didn't know that they were eligible for unemployment. They didn't want unemployment because of a stigma associated with it, or because they simply could not wait any longer for their unemployment benefits. And especially concerning are the situations of immigrant workers, many of whom believed that they were not eligible for any type of unemployment funds, and instead they were turning to public assistance programs as an alternative. And many of these workers are documented, they are green card holders, but they were worried about what turning to unemployment might mean for them in terms of obtaining future citizenship. We also had a number of workers who did not want to apply for unemployment. They felt that it was stigmatized. They had heard all of this rhetoric about being dependent on the government, and they felt that a job was a job, even if it paid less than unemployment. For some workers, getting a job in the gig economy was actually considered to give them a sense of destiny control, even though it really was kind of raising potential problems for them. And in some cases, it was considered to be an alternative to being trapped at home, especially in New York, where many of those homes tend to be a little bit smaller. They tend to be crowded. You might have multiple generations living in relatively close confines. Some of these workers are truly turning to gig work as an occupation of last resort. They are desperate to feed their families. They've started going to food banks. They have been waiting in pantry lines. And this is the only way they can think of to get money for their landlord and to feed their families. So this pandemic means that we've seen a number of workers turning to the side hustle safety net when they experience job loss or a slashing of their work hours. Of the 200 gig workers that we interviewed, 28% had some college, 36% had a bachelor's degree, 18% had at least some graduate school, and that actually included a handful of workers with doctorates, including a physical therapist whose hours were cut, and she was doing Instacart and Shipt and Uber Eats deliveries. Another worker who had two other workers who had medical degrees that were not working as doctors, and they were turning to dog walking and food delivery in order to make ends meet. We've seen that companies will increasingly try to do anything they can to reduce their costs and to reduce their obligations to labor. And so I think we're going to see many more jobs become 1099 based, become independent contractors with none of the protections that, quite frankly, generations of our grandparents and great grandparents fought for. You know, this gig economy, this movement to 1099 employment is very much a movement forward to the past. We probably need to see a larger governmental effort to sort of renew something like WPA, right? We need a jobs program to help these unemployed workers get back into more stable employment, because once they have that stable employment, then it's going to be much easier for them to move back into a private workforce.
As you stated, I started back in 2017 in August. And prior to that, I was on a waiting list to start driving for Uber. I was told by my friends who drove for Uber that they were making pretty good money, especially supplemental for their full-time job. And like Vienna stated, you know, most the best hours were on the weekends and at night. So 6 months later, I was called by Uber and was given the opportunity to drive for them. And I wasn't the only one. Thousands of other drivers were taken off waiting lists and were given the opportunity to drive. And we were even offered to get non-expensive leases through Uber XL or Avis or Hertz, who they had partnered with, so they could get more drivers on the road, especially with newer vehicles. It didn't matter if you didn't own a vehicle or you had a junker, you were offered those opportunities as well. And then after that, we started noticing that the applications were saturated with drivers throughout San Diego County. And we come to find out that, you know, Uber and Lyft were having a battle for turf. So because we were considered as free human capital, it didn't cost them a dime except for the background checks, the supposed background checks. Because we later come to find out that even though they sent them out, they weren't really done. And so we had bad individuals driving for Uber and Lyft. And so we ended up having to work more hours than we were normally accustomed to working. So not only that, if you were working 60 hours, 80 hours, 20 hours or 15 hours of that time was spent driving around with no ride. You were on the app driving around, but you were just spinning the wheels and your time and spending gas. So later on after that, we started also noticing that our pay started going down. It went from 15% to 25%. And that was around the time that Uber and Lyft started their new project with the scooters. And we felt that the reason that the fees went up to 25% of the rise was because we're recovering those fees instead of the company and their investors. The drivers were the ones paying for that project. So not only that, we also noticed because passengers started getting privy of the shenanigans Uber and Lyft were doing to their drivers, and they would ask us, how's working for Uber and Lyft doing? Is it true that you guys are not getting tips, or you're getting less pay now? And because a lot of the passengers were open to this and they were sympathetic to us as drivers, they would even share how much they were charged. So there was times where we would find out that on our app as drivers, Uber stated that they charged the passenger $40. In reality, the passenger would tell us that they were charged $55. So we're getting 25% of $40, not $55. Not only that, there was times where they started offering tools like surges or hotspots where there was a surge of demand by passengers. Or if you were to drive really good and got good ratings, you would get gold or platinum or diamond status, and you were able to see like how far you were going to drive off to pick up a passenger and how long the ride was with the passenger on board, and what the rating was of the passenger. Because a lot of us, we didn't want to pick up passengers that had 3.5 stars or less, because we felt that they were troublemakers or something. They didn't get 3.5 stars for no reason, right? But we ended up finding out that that was to so they can prove to California that they didn't qualify for the 3-prong test, stating that we need to be employees. But in reality, the app was disguised in sheep's clothing because it was working against us. Like I said, if we were to pick up a passenger before, you didn't know how long the ride was to get there. When you have these options that give us the flexibility, supposedly, we come to find out you're going to pick up someone who's 10, 18 minutes away, even 24 minutes away, to only give them a 5-minute ride. I mean, where's the profit in that? There was a time where they would tell you, oh, you're going to get paid between $24 and $28 for this ride. But in reality, you got paid $16, $18. So they would sneak that ride into our app by saying that we're going to get paid more when we didn't. There's no flexibility. They own you. If you start denying rides, the long rides, the long pickup rides, you start denying those. You start denying rides of passengers who have 3.5 stars or less. Or if you're about to run out of your 12-hour shift that they allow you to drive because you're about to get a ride from San Diego to LAX, and you know it's going to be unsafe, you don't want to fall asleep behind the wheel, and you deny it, all of a sudden you start getting the worst rides of the worst. They penalize you by giving you more longer ride pickups, shorter rides. They don't give you the long rides to LAX, to Long Beach, to Santa Barbara. They're not giving you comfort rides. They're making you get stuck in the regular X Uber rides. So there's no flexibility there. They're lying. It's just straight out lying. I would start Friday nights at 11 o'clock, and I would end Monday morning at 4 o'clock. And I was normally sleeping 4 hours. between each day. And I would make an average of $850 to $1,200. The same amount of money that someone would work during the days, during 6 days a week. After the pandemic, it dropped down to 350, 550 the most, you know, and that was a big chunk. And other people saw it worse who worked during the day because obviously during the pandemic, everyone was quarantined. There wasn't people going to work. There wasn't stores or malls open, so they saw it worse, you know. If Uber and Lyft really, really wanted to offer the benefit packages that they're offering now on the ballot, the $200 million that they're spending on the campaign would have covered 3 years of benefits. Right now, we're talking about drivers, but after November, if Prop 22 passes, I believe we're going to be talking about teachers, nurses, welders, grocers. We're gonna be seeing that on the apps, you know, and all of those people are going to be in the same boat as the drivers as we are now, you know. And it's just unbelievable that you had the Black and Latino Chamber of Commerce on board, and it's even more disgraceful to see the Si Se Puede Foundation, because minorities are being hit more with this. We had drivers that that didn't qualify for EDD. So what they did is they tried to apply for personal loans at the banks, and guess what? The banks told them, "You're in the red. We can't loan you." We should vote no on this proposition because we need the benefits. We don't want to depend on public assistance while we're working for multi-billion-dollar corporations. We also need to provide W-2s in order to be able to rent a house, buy a house, or rent an apartment. Imagine also if we have kids that are about to go to college and they want to apply for a grant or assistance. How are we going to prove to them income if we're not given a W-2?